Adamson Tannehill, May 23, 1750 through December 23, 1820, was an American military officer, politician, civic leader, and farmer. Born in Frederick County, Maryland, Tannehill was among the first volunteers to join the newly established Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War, serving from June 1775 until 1781. He was promoted to captain and was commander of the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment, the longest-serving Continental Rifle unit of the war. After the conflict, Tannehill settled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, his last military posting of the war. He was active in the Pennsylvania State Militia, rising to the rank of Major General in 1811. Tannehill served as a Brigadier General of United States Volunteers in the War of 1812. Gravestone of Adamson Tannehill, Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Regarding Adamson Tannehill as member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Pennsylvania's 14th District, he was in office from March 4, 1813 through March 3, 1815. He was not preceded by anyone as the seat was newly established. He was succeeded by John Woods. Regarding his personal details, he was born May 23, 1750 in Frederick County, Maryland. He died December 23, 1820 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, U.S. His resting place is Allegheny Cemetery, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, U.S. His political party was Democratic-Republican. His spouse was Agnes Morgan or Agnes Maria or Agnes Heth. His profession was as a military officer, politician, civic leader, and farmer. Regarding his military service, his allegiance was to the United States of America. The branches, services he served in were the Continental Army, Pennsylvania Militia, and United States Volunteers. His years of service were 1775 to 1781 and 1788 to 1812. His ranks were Captain, Continental Army, Brigadier General, United States Volunteers, and Major General, Pennsylvania Militia. The battles, wars he fought in were the American Revolutionary War and War of 1812. Tannehill was an early citizen of Pittsburgh and a Pennsylvania politician who held several local, state, and national appointed and elected offices. These included one term as a Democratic-Republican in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1813 to 1815 and President of the Pittsburgh branch of the Bank of the United States starting in 1817 until his death in 1820. He also served on the founding boards of several civic and state organizations. In late 1800, Tannehill, while a justice of the peace, was alleged to have charged more than was allowed by law for 2 probates and was convicted of extortion. He was reinstated to office shortly after by the governor of Pennsylvania. Tannehill died in 1820 near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was buried at his Grove Hill home outside Pittsburgh and later reinterred in Allegheny Cemetery. Adamson Tannehill was born May 23, 1750, in Frederick County, Maryland, the oldest of 9 children born to John Tannehill, owner of a tobacco plantation, and Rachel Adamson Tannehill. Adamson's maternal grandfather took a special interest in the grandchild who bore his name, and he provided such pecuniary assistance as to secure a fine education for him. Little else is known of Adamson's youth and upbringing. No portraits of him are known to exist. Family records state that as an adult he was 6 feet in height, well-proportioned and of commanding appearance. A Continental Army commission for 3rd Lieutenant Adamson Tannehill, gentleman, of Captain Otho Holland Williams Independent Rifle Company, dated January 1, 1776. The document is signed by Charles Thomson, Secretary of the Continental Congress, and by John Hancock, President of Congress. Williams had replaced Thomas Price as captain of the company in late 1775. At the age of 25, Tannehill was among the first volunteers to enlist in one of the earliest American military units to form when the American Revolutionary War started in the spring of 1775. He served in the Continental Army, initially as a sergeant in Captain Thomas Price's Independent Rifle Company, one of the original 10 independent rifle companies authorized by the Continental Congress. He received his commission dated January 1, 1776, as a third lieutenant, while serving at the Siege of Boston. In mid-June the same year, Tannehill and his company were incorporated into the newly organized Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment, when he advanced to second lieutenant. In mid-November 1776, a large portion of Tannehill's regiment was captured or killed at the Battle of Fort Washington on northern Manhattan Island. The remainder, including Tannehill, continued to serve actively in the Continental Army. They participated in the battles of Trenton and Princeton and the Forage War. In the late spring of 1777, they were administratively attached to the 11th Virginia Regiment due to the losses incurred in their rifle regiment. Tannehill was promoted to first lieutenant on May 18, 1777, and the following month he was attached to the newly organized Provisional Rifle Corps commanded by Colonel Daniel Morgan. This regiment-size force of about 500 men played a major role in the battles of Saratoga in late 1777 and a peripheral role in the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778. Tannehill was probably detached from the Rifle Corps in mid-1778 and returned to the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment, his permanent unit. This occurred when Lieutenant Colonel Moses Rawlings, the regiment's commander, was marshalling the remnants of his unit and recruiting new members while stationed at Fort Frederick, Maryland. In early 1779 Tannehill and the regiment were assigned to Fort Pitt of present-day western Pennsylvania, where they supplemented other Continental forces engaged in the defense of frontier settlements from Indian raids. The high mark of this effort was the 600-man Brodhead campaign against hostile Mingo and Munsee Indians conducted in the late summer of 1779. Tannehill was promoted to captain on July 29, 1779, and by late 1780 commanded the regiment and was commandant of Fort McIntosh located in western Pennsylvania northwest of Fort Pitt. He was discharged from service on January 1, 1781, when several regiments, including Tannehill's, were disbanded as a result of Congress's major 1781 reorganization of the Continental Army instituted largely to reduce expenditures. The Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment was the longest-serving Continental Rifle unit of the war. Tannehill was admitted as an original member of the Society of the Cincinnati in the state of Maryland when it was established in 1783. After his Revolutionary War service, Tannehill settled in frontier Pittsburgh, as did many other Revolutionary War officers. He initially engaged in farming and was a tavern owner and vintner. He was also a significant landholder and a large buyer of land lots in early Pittsburgh, land purchased directly from the heirs of William Penn. From 1784 until around 1792, Tannehill owned and operated the riverfront Green Tree Tavern and Inn, residing in the adjacent house, both located mid-block between Market and Wood Streets in Pittsburgh. In around 1792, he moved to his new Grove Hill estate, which became popular as a local center for political meetings while owned by Tannehill. The property was located on Grants Hill just northeast of Pittsburgh. One of the buildings at Grove Hill, known as the Bowery, was the site of large annual social gatherings hosted by Tannehill where citizens of Pittsburgh came together each 4th of July to hail with joyful hearts the day that gave birth to the liberties and happiness of their country. Tannehill lived at Grove Hill until his death in 1820. Depiction of Fort Pitt about 1780 at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela, foreground, rivers, showing the early town development of Pittsburgh, right. Tannehill began public service no later than 1794 when the borough of Pittsburgh was established. That year, He was appointed president of the Pittsburgh Fire Company and elected one of 3 surveyors of Pittsburgh. In March 1790, Tannehill had unsuccessfully solicited a public appointment in the administration of President George Washington by writing to Washington's personal secretary, Tobias Lear, who had visited Pittsburgh and lodged with Tannehill at his inn 4 years before. In his note, Tannehill mentioned that Washington has some acquaintance, sick, of me, which may probably have some weight, referring to instances of direct interaction the 2 men had during the American Revolution. Sometime before 1794, Tannehill was appointed a justice of the peace of Allegheny County, an administrative unit that included Pittsburgh. In October 1800, he was temporarily removed from this office after being convicted of extortion related to an event that occurred 5 years before, in which he was alleged to have charged 2 shillings more than was allowed by law for 2 probates. He was issued a reprimand and fined $50. Tannehill was quickly reinstated to office in January 1801 by Governor Thomas McKean, the former Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, was refunded his fine, and subsequently held several prominent elected and appointed public offices. Tannehill believed the charges against him had marred his reputation and vehemently disclaimed any guilt for the rest of his life. His resentment toward whom he called 2 of the most unprincipled scoundrels who ever appeared before a court of justice, and what he characterized as their false swearing and vile slander, was still strong 15 years later when he reflected on the affair in his will. Tannehill was active in the state militia, serving as a lieutenant colonel in the Westmoreland County Militia starting in 1788. On August 3, 1811, Pennsylvania Governor Simon Snyder promoted Tannehill to Major General of a Pennsylvania militia division drawn from Allegheny, Armstrong, and Indiana counties. A view of Pittsburgh in 1817, showing Adamson Tannehill's estate, Grove Hill, on Grant's Hill upslope of city, left center. The lithograph is based on a contemporaneous sketch. Tannehill served as a founding member of the board of directors of the Pittsburgh branch of the Bank of Pennsylvania, starting in 1804. This was the first bank established in Pittsburgh and the first one west of the Allegheny Mountains. He was then appointed by the Pennsylvania legislature as one of 5 turnpike commissioners for the state starting in 1811. Tannehill was also chosen by the state legislature as an elector of the 1812 Federal Electoral College for the state of Pennsylvania. After the War of 1812 broke out, Tannehill served as a brigadier general commanding 4 infantry and rifle regiments of United States Volunteers. His military duties during the limited duration of the conflict in western Pennsylvania lasted from September 25 to December 31, 1812. Meanwhile, outside of public office, Tannehill served as a trustee of the First Presbyterian Church of Pittsburgh starting in 1787. He was also a member of the Fraternal Tammany Society, which was founded after the American Revolution in several American cities, including Pittsburgh. The society focused on the celebration of American identity and culture. Members of the society in its earliest years closely allied themselves with the Democratic-Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. Consequently, when Jefferson announced his intent to withdraw from public service in 1808, Tannehill, in his capacity as Grand Sachem, high official, of the Pittsburgh Tammany Society, wrote to Brother Jefferson, expressing heartfelt regret over his resolution to retire from the duties of protecting thy children, of this tribe. Although Pittsburgh was a stronghold of the Federalist Party in the city's earliest years, between 1798 and 1800 the rival Democratic-Republican Party began to prosper under such men as Adamson Tannehill, who had become chairman of the city's Republican Party by 1800. The high point of Tannehill's active political career was his election as a Democratic-Republican to the 13th U.S. Congress on October 13, 1812. Tannehill was elected to serve Pennsylvania's newly established 14th congressional district with 48% of the vote, defeating Federalist John Woods and Democratic-Republican John Wilson, who received 39.3 and 12.7% of the vote, respectively. Tannehill served from March 4, 1813, to March 3, 1815, casting 322 votes and missing 30. Tannehill ran for re-election on October 11, 1814, again as a Democratic-Republican. He lost his re-election bid, receiving 49.5% of the vote. His opponent, John Woods, who he had defeated 2 years earlier, won with 50.5% of the vote. Following his tenure in Congress, Tannehill served as president of the Pittsburgh branch of the Bank of the United States starting in 1817 and ending with his death in 1820. Tannehill died at his Grove Hill home just outside Pittsburgh on December 23, 1820, aged 70 years and 7 months. He was survived by his wife, Agnes M. Tannehill, and his ward, Sidney Tannehill Mountain. Adamson and Agnes had no children. Tannehill was interred at his Grove Hill home, as specified in his will. His 1820 obituary relates that his remains were accompanied to the grave by a large concourse of his fellow citizens and were interred with military funeral honors by 2 volunteer corps of the Pittsburgh area. Tannehill's body was reinterred in Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh on April 26, 1849, because urban spread and city road construction necessitated moving his Grove Hill grave. The archive files of a prominent Pittsburgh newspaper provide detail on this reinterment. After the Big Fire in 1845, when the Pittsburgh City Council extended the city limits to take in the farms on what is now the Hill District. It was found that in extending Wiley Avenue, Colonel Adamson Tannehill's grave would be between the curbs. About 1851, the council decided to remove the colonel's remains to Allegheny Cemetery. The Tannehill family objected, but, then, agreed to make the transfer themselves.